In the 1950s and 60s, Alan Watts saw something in the Western psyche that still feels painfully relevant today. He saw a civilization in a psychosis of hyper-driven restlessness whose people couldn't stop pushing even when it was killing them. And throughout his written work, also across the many hours of recorded lectures still to be found online, one of the most common plights that Alan Watts diagnosed in society was that of Western man's disconnect from nature. As a pilgrim and nomad himself, who made his way from London to New York and then on to California, he will have been all too aware of the awesome frontier that was the Wild West, and how white man forged his way untrammeled through ravines, rivers and more to finally arrive at that Pacific coast. Now, by the mid-19th century, which was the zenith of Victorian exploration, the lands now known as Colorado, Utah and Nevada, they were the last obstacle to a sphere of influence over the North Pacific Ocean. The sheer will of force required to blast tunnels into the face of the Rocky and Sierra Nevada mountains, before finally taking 30,000 migrant workforce to grade the earth, lay the railroad that would become the first transcontinental. This was a testament to the age in which man subdued nature. Now, he was born in 1915, and Watts was the child of this Victorian lineage that saw how the Western mind, rather than participate in reality, felt the need always to dominate, to predict and to optimize its surroundings, as if uncertainty itself were intolerable to them. His generation, born subject of the largest empire in history and on the advent of mechanized warfare, and whose grandparents had unlocked vast swathes of the earth through industrial advancement, they were obsessed with control. They held a strong aversion to letting things unfold on their own, as if everything valuable must be engineered directly. And Watts was raised by middle-class parents. He attended boarding school, he had a run at a scholarship for Oxford. He was primed to become another cog in the system, but he failed his examination essay to Oxford, perhaps intentionally, and so he began upon a more circuitous path. Not even a stint working at the bank shortly after could deter him from a growing interest in philosophy, the psyche, and the inner terrain that would end up becoming his legacy. And although he was enamoured by Zen from a young age, it was Christianity that dictated his subsequent move, when he was ordained as an Episcopalian priest in New York 2 days after Germany surrendered in World War II. Now, that contrast between Protestant industriousness and Zen Buddhism in 1945, it would have been stark to say the least. Having experienced the teachings of non-duality, trust in process, and direct experience in the Zen Buddhist circle, only to renege and commit himself to the liturgical doctrine of obedience and strain from the church, Watts tried desperately to reconcile these two disparate things in his own works. In spite of his priesthood, perhaps, he lands in California in 1951 and joins the American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco that year, its inaugural year. Here he becomes more formally acquainted with Taoism and studied Chinese in its multiple forms and in great detail, and it can't really be overstated just how radical a departure this environment would have been at the time, because it placed him within the most progressive cultural frontier that existed in the Anglosphere. This gave him a new language, a language of pattern, of balance, of rhythm, and energetic proportion to diagnose the maladies that existed in the West at that time, which was a lexicon totally foreign to the patient. Watts dove headfirst into all the literature he could find, and he became acquainted with modalities separate from, but parallel to, Zen, which had first captured his imagination. What developed from ancient Chinese texts like the Tao Te Ching in the 3rd century BCE were cosmological concepts like Wu Jing. And in the West, we call this idea of Wu Jing the 5 elements. They describe the 5 dynamic phases of life. You have wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, through which all growth, balance, excess, and descent in the living world can be understood. The restlessness, the overexertion, the pushiness that his contemporaries in New York and London, that they called progress, it became clear in the light of day once he had arrived on the West Coast. To him, it was simple. Life was out of balance. The wood was out of balance. The symptoms of Western anxiety in society at that time were glaringly obvious to anybody who even took a cursory look. There was a compulsion to optimize, increasing urgency without any sense of proportion and balance, an ambition that lacked regulation, and constant movement, constantly hurrying, bustling without any sense of clear direction. All of these things pointed straight at an unrootedness that the Wu Jing poetically delineated. In 5 elements theory, wood is critical for our sense of direction. is critical for our movement, our vision, our planning, and our execution. And when the wood is healthy and harmonious, we see flexibility, we see momentum, we see appropriate decision making. When it's been corrupted or distorted, that leads to frustration, to irritability, to overreach, and even to aggression. And by the mid-19th century, a time that we look at as being beautifully simplistic and free from the pernicious tendencies of the hyper-irritable postmodern humans, there was still a jostling feeling that society was moving in the wrong direction. By the 1950s, it was even worse. Consumer capitalism was rampant. Technology seemed to be crossing unimaginable thresholds every single day, and the march of progress was running at double speed, and generational divides became chasmic for the first time ever in history. Ambition, when unimpeded, with incessant movement and constant forward projection, were unnatural and wholly inappropriate to the living world. Growth, when severed from depth, rootedness, nourishment, and containment, runs totally wild. So it was no wonder that disenchantment became rife amongst people. At the epicenter of the first mass countercultural movement, Watts looked to soften this distortion and remedy the hysteria engulfing society with a sanity that had been formulated in the Wudang Mountains in the Warring States period of ancient China and lived peacefully there for 2,000 years without impinging on the West. What crystallized in his writings from this time was that life was not a problem that needed to be solved, but an experience to be lived. When it's in balance, the wood can be flexible, adaptive, creative, grounded, and patient. It can still be ambitious and decisive, but with intent and without compulsion. By understanding the 5 phases as a natural cycle beyond our control, Taoism teaches us to move with rather than against reality. This is the concept of wu wei, effortless action, or flow without force. Watts expanded this idea continuously for the rest of his life, not as another dogmatic sermon like those of his youth, but through playful prose and an insistence on play itself. What emerges in his books like Nature, Man and Woman from 1958, or the 1961 publication, Psychotherapy East and West, is him offering a remedy to pathological wood. Less force, more participation. For him it was a simple prescription, but one that was revelatory to a dominant generation of seekers whose direction in an ever-changing world was totally in flux. The short-lived and ultimately misguided hippie movement that had sprung from Watts's corner of Northern California by the end of the decade was an attempt in itself to personify the creativity and organic flexibility of the wood in balance. The return to nature that the counterculture advocated for was well-intentioned and precisely the antidote to the problem, but ultimately it was short-lived, because cities, by their nature, they distort the wood, both literally and metaphorically. Urban hustle keeps people in a state of perpetual forward activation. An absence of horizon compresses perception, and rigid schedules laugh in the face of flexibility. And living in the modern cities, despite attempts to escape from them, people were inevitably drawn back to them and found themselves contained within. The flower children came to realize that their revolution would not be a global one, not only because the structures and institutions had become too comfortable for most to abandon, but because their direction too had become fragmented, and the movement remained completely unrooted, which is the opposite of wood in balance. What Watts understood, and what the 5 elements still makes startlingly legible, is that anxiety is not only an individual pathology. Often it's a cultural pattern. It's an energetic climate, or a distortion on a civilizational level that remains internalized until it becomes absorbed and integrated into our own character. It has been ingrained in many of us from a young age that chronic activation, agitated ambition, and forward projection leads to a successful life. This is drive, purpose, goal setting. But wood that is cut off from water's depth, and earth's nourishment, and metal's restraint will eventually turn on itself. Now, without wisdom, orientation, or restraint, nature becomes totally disordered, and the progress of wood's growth becomes an unbearable pressure. That diagnosis has only become more acute. Although Watts was speaking to a generation caught in the first great acceleration of consumer modernity, we have arrived in 2026 in its imperfectly perfected form. We are digitally compressed, environmentally overloaded, overstimulated, and urged ever onward by the systems that profit from our inability to rest. The real lasting gift of Alan Watts, a man who did not have all the answers, and who did himself fall prey to many of the vices and trappings he espoused against, was his pointing toward a different rhythm of being. This system, in which participation replaces domination, where proportion tempers growth and reality is to be played with, not conquered, this has continued to find larger and larger audiences whilst remaining largely medicinal. If Western anxiety is indeed, at least in part, a crisis of the wood, then the solution is not to extinguish drive altogether, but to reroute it in nature, in its timing, and in the body. This is what I'm going to be talking about in greater detail in the upcoming videos. If this resonates with you, or if you find it of interest, subscribe to follow along.